Thank you again for logging in. We're just waiting a few more minutes for the rest of our attendees to log on. So we'll start shortly. We're just going to give it about 2 more minutes to make sure that we have everyone logged on who plan to register for today and to resolve quick technical difficulties, but we will be right there. Okay, we are just about to get started. It's amazing to see how many of you are logging on. I'd like to welcome you to Jewish Family Services Community Conversation on becoming an anti-racist Jewish community. My name is Carol Yellen. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Jewish Family Service San Diego. And also, I'm happy to see so many of you opting in. Overwhelming response that we quickly hit our Zoom capacity. And so we are also streaming this on our YouTube channel for those who were unable to register. If you know someone who needs to log on to our YouTube channel, they can visit www.jfssd.com/YouTube. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be posted on our JFS website later today, along with additional resources. So I just want to start by thanking all of our Jewish community sponsors for coming together in support of today's conversation. While we will certainly be talking about how each of us can start at an individual level, we have seen the power of our Jewish community coming together to create change. Just as we are always united against anti-Semitism, and more recently, we've come together locally and nationally for the humane treatment of immigrants and refugees, so too must we now reflect on how we as a Jewish community will unite and take action on behalf of our Black neighbors, including those loved ones within our own families, our coworkers, and for the Jews of colors in our synagogue. The Jewish community has a long history of fighting injustice, grounded in our values of tzedek, which means justice, and tikkun olam, which means repairing the world. But we must not only rely on speaking to those values, but committing or recommitting to tangible actions to undo the systemic racism experienced by the African American and Black lives every day. And so it starts with each of us being vulnerable to examine our own implicit biases, and then having the sometimes uncomfortable yet necessary conversations with our kids and our families and as a community. And so we hope that that is why you have chosen to join us today. Today is only the start of the conversation, and it will certainly not mark the end. At JFS, we are committed to continuing these hard conversations, both within our organization and the Jewish community, as well as the broader community. And so to help us out with today's initial conversation, we've brought in a well-respected group of panelists who are on their own journey. I'd like to start by introducing Rabbi Yael Berg. She serves as the rabbi at Congregation Dor Hadash in San Diego. For 12 years, she served as the rabbi the West End Synagogue in New York City. She's a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And in addition to her congregational responsibilities, transparently, Rabbi Berg has also served as a board member at Jewish Family Service San Diego, as well as on the board of the San Diego Jewish Academy. We're very happy to have her with us today. Our second panelist is Kelsey Greenberg-Young. Kelsey is the education director at the Anti-Defamation League San Diego. She coordinates ADL's partnerships with schools in the San Diego region, assisting them in the creation and implementation of the No Place for Hate programs that enhance and sustain inclusive school campus climates. Kelsey received her BA in communication from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for being with us today. Our last panelist is Dr. Micah Parzan. He joined the San Diego Museum of Man as its CEO in August of 2010. He is an anthropologist with a PhD from Case Western Reserve University and a BA from UC Berkeley, as well as an attorney, receiving his Juris Doctorate from UC Davis. One of the most important things that the Museum of Man has done under Micah's leadership is bringing the Race, Are We So Different exhibit to San Diego as a permanent feature. This award-winning exhibit challenges the idea that race is biological or genetic and focuses on race as a cultural construct. It examines how science reinforced that construct and how it became systematically embedded in our institutions and the experience of race and racism in everyday life. We thank you, Dr. Parzan, for being here. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Nate Looney. Nate is the Jews of Color recruiter at Avodah, who have been training emerging Jewish leaders to take on the most pressing social and economic issues in America for the past 20 years. Nate leads their diversity strategies with a focus on Jews of color. Nate is also the CEO and owner of Westside Urban Gardens, an urban agricultural company based in Los Angeles. He is an AJU alum, an entrepreneur, a strategist, a US Army veteran, and an urban farmer. Nate is also a graduate of the Jeremiah Fellow, a SELA alum, and is the chair of the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce Inclusion Task Force. He currently consults on agricultural startups and speaks about intersectionality and diversity. So before I turn it over to Nate to begin, please note that if you have any questions for our panelists during this conversation, for those of you on the Zoom call, you can submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to address them toward the end of our time together today. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Nate to begin our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. So if you're watching this today, if you're watching this right now, I imagine you're here because you want to learn something. The past few weeks have been an onslaught for a lot of folks, and as a country, it has left us raw. And we're in a place where there's time for healing, and this is an opportunity for growth that we're entering into in this next hour. There was something about George Floyd's murder that sparked something in so many people in this country that all of the other videos and all of the other narratives wasn't able to spark. What's not important is focusing on that, but focusing on the fact that we have created the spark. And so now that there's this spark, what are we going to do with it, and how do we move forward, acknowledging what has happened in the past? And in particular, as we're talking about the Black community, recognizing that this is not a us and a them situation, but this is all of us. You know, the Black Jewish community is a part of the Jewish community, not just an offshoot of it. So what does it mean for us to move forward together as a unit, as a family, as mishpacha? What does that all mean? So what I'm asking of everyone that's watching today is to lean in. The reason why I'm not actually on the panel and I'm just moderating is because as a community, people of color have spent the past 450 plus years trying to get our white cousins to understand the significance of what we've experienced in this time period from the past even till now. So instead of hearing it from Black leaders of color, Black Jewish leaders of color, right now, what's important is for us to work together and for you to listen to stories and the panelists being transparent about how they've addressed racism and implicit biases in their own lives and how they move forward. I want you to lean in because there are going to be some things about this discussion that are going to be uncomfortable. There are going to be things about this discussion that may trigger things in you, and that's okay. Sit with it, because that is where the real learning is going to happen. You can't have growth unless something breaks first. And this is something that I learned in agriculture and in farming. There has to be a change. You can't stay the same and then expect different results. So with that being said, I want to open up by just diving right on in, because this is a very short amount of time that we have. And I recognize that these questions that we're going to be talking about, each one, we could spend an hour on it. So to bring it down into bite-sized pieces, understand that this is only the beginning. This is only meant to further spark your interest and to encourage you to learn more, encourage you to enter into difficult dialogue with your friends, your family, your shul members. So stay present and stay here with us. So with that, I'm going to jump right on into some questions. So the first question that I have is for everyone. And the question is, what does white privilege mean to you? And can you share an instance where it's shown up in your life? Kelsey, go ahead.
Thanks, Nate. So this question has a lot of components for me. I can think about instances about growing up. I can think about instances through my childhood, my adult life, etc. But I think I want to share my answer as it relates to the present. This week, I have been having a whole lot of conversations with parents, white parents particularly, about what they could possibly be doing right now to explain the murder of George Floyd, or explain the racism running rampant in our country and the ways that we can be allies to those targeted by this hate. And we've gone over it from every angle. We've talked about asking questions and exploring diversity, processing through art, reading books, speaking clearly and concisely, etc. And it's been exhausting. It's been exhausting for me. It's been exhausting for them to talk about racism so often for the past 2 weeks. And so if it has been this tiring for me to talk about racism for the past 2 weeks, I cannot even begin to imagine what it must be like to experience racism every day of your life. And if I choose, I can take a break. I can shut off my computer. I can put work on pause. I can take a rest on Shabbat. And that ability to remove myself, that's how white privilege is showing up in my life right now.
Thank you for that. I think that really kind of speaks to what we're trying to get at, is like having people understand like what it looks like in their own shoes, instead of the defense response of like, that can't be a thing. So I really appreciate that. Rabbi, were you next?
Sure. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So I understand white privilege in my own life to be about my body. It's about how I am seen in the world, not who I am or how I feel or the education I've received or the religion I practice or the friends that I keep. It's about how I am seen. And I can say that I have always understood that sort of in a subconscious way, but in January, I was able to go to the Equal Justice Initiative's Museum and Center in Montgomery, Alabama, with TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. And one of the things that I truly learned in that moment about privilege and about how I understand my life as a Jew is that I don't think I truly understood until that trip how close to the surface the experience of slavery is for Black people, that it lives in their bodies all the time. And if I know a little bit about my family did not survive the Holocaust, my family was not in the Holocaust, but I feel a proximity to that experience, but I'm able to let it go pretty much all the time. I don't always think about it. But what I really understood at that moment, and this was just 4 or 5 months ago, 6 months ago, is just how proximate the experience of slavery is for Black people, and how everything that is experienced in life can directly relate to that. And I didn't know that, and I don't feel that. And that's how white privilege speaks to me in this moment.
Sure. I think it's something that's so nuanced, and it's not just there's no black and white answer of what white privilege can look like. So I really appreciate the difference in how it's showing up for each of you. Micah, what do you want to say about this?
Thanks, Nate. I'd like to just start by saying thank you to JFS for the opportunity to participate in this critically important discussion, and even more so to all of you who are tuned in today. You know, it says an enormous amount about you as individuals that you decided to be here. This is extraordinarily hard work, and by being here, you are doing that work. So thank you all for that. I don't consider myself an expert in this area necessarily, but like all of us, as Carol indicated, I'm on a journey. And for me, that's been sort of 30 years trying to walk in the shoes of other people to the greatest extent possible, and trying not only to understand, but also to sort of feel their pain as much as I possibly can. For me, that looked like years in a career as an anthropologist, and then as an employment attorney, and now leading the Museum of Man. And I think that metaphor of a journey is a really useful one, particularly as we talk about white privilege. As a white man, among many other privileges, my white privilege has really paved a super highway of success for me. It has afforded me countless opportunities that have been denied to peoples of color. And while I'm profoundly grateful for those opportunities, and even proud of the ways that I put them to good use, I also know that they came and they continue to come on the backs of people of color. The benefits that I have enjoyed and my family has enjoyed have come at a shameful cost in many ways to so many of my fellow human beings. While my journey was made a lot easier, it has been a lot harder for so many people. And that really causes damage for every one of us, albeit in very different ways, and especially in the form of trauma for peoples of color, including, importantly, Native and Indigenous peoples. And I think it's critical to recognize that there's a relationship between what we're talking about today, white privilege, and what some people refer to as settler privilege. As so many Native scholars, people like Brian Stevenson and others have written, the genocide of Native peoples in this country was sort of the original sin. There was a dehumanizing of the other that really set the stage for slavery, its aftermath, and the structural inequities that are at the core of who we are as Americans. Many of us don't know, or let alone regularly think about, the fact that the land that I am sitting on here in Point Loma, and I assume virtually all of us, maybe not Nate, who's in New York, I think, but anybody in San Diego County or Baja, that this is the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay peoples, and that the Kumeyaay were displaced and dispossessed from that land so that all of us could one day live here. And without that violence, we aren't having this conversation, at least in this place today. For the Kumeyaay, that's not just a 100-year-old wound, but a living legacy of harm that is repeated over and over again in ways large and small. So to me, that's a really powerful example of privilege in action. And it really creates an obligation on all of us to think about, how do we participate in being part of the solution instead of continuing to be a part of the problem? And how do we move forward to make that right however we can?
Thank you for that. I'm in Southern California as well. So it's a different, a little bit further north of you all, but still in Southern California. It's so interesting that we're talking about what white privilege is, because so many times there's the assumption that to be Jewish means that you have white skin. So my next question is, what does it mean to hold both your Jewish identity with your white privilege? And Rabbi Yael, go ahead.
So, I think this is the crux of the matter for many Jews who descend primarily from Ashkenazi lineage and from Eastern Europe or Western Europe, and this idea that many of us have ancestors who left Eastern Europe. They were persecuted, and there, in those moments, in that time, my grandmother from Romania, they were other in that community, right? In that time, they were the other of Eastern Europe in the 1920s when my grandmother came to America. They were seen as alien, right? And they came over on ships yearning to breathe free, but they made a choice. And in a sense, they were able to do that. They were not literally taken against their will, but they certainly came with a sense that persecution was driving them. And to come to America, the Golden Medina, right, this land that was imagined to be just, the promised land of the 20th century, meant that they sacrificed so much so that they could be Americans, right? Which meant at that time that they could be white. Because to blend into America in the early 20th century, to be successful, meant to be like the white Christian majority. And so as a result, we had all these privileges. They were hard fought, don't get me wrong, the amount of effort and the amount of work and the quote unquote, the bootstrap pulling that our communities did, but they had bootstraps. And so even when we were kept out of industries as a Jewish people and out of areas of business, we came to feel important as we rose through whatever ranks of success we did. And that's our story, right? Those of us who come from an Ashkenazi background, that's our Jewish story. And so it's hard, I think, for many of us to both hold that sense of, but wait, I was a persecuted minority. And to also say, I'm part of a majority culture now that, like I said before, is seen by others as part of the majority. You can say, I'm not a racist, but until you act in anti-racist ways as a white person or a white passing person, which I consider myself to be, then you are, in a sense, or I'll speak for myself, I would, in a sense, be maintaining, right, that same system that allows me to go forward and do what I do. And yes, I'm a rabbi, I work in the Jewish community, that's my whole world. But I can think, and I can be proud of the ways in which, as Jews, we look to our tradition to not only ask, where are we, right? The first question of the Torah that God is imagined to ask Adam, Ayeka, where are you? And then the second question that is asked to Cain, where is your brother? And those are the two Jewish questions. And if we can't, I feel in this moment, our job in holding both the white and the Jewish is to be able to answer both of those questions honestly, and with the kind of cheshbon nefesh, the kind of introspection that's called for at this moment.
Sure. Thank you for that. Kelsey, go ahead.
That's a hard question. It's a really hard question. And it takes some reflection on my own experiences to even understand how those two things collide, how those two things are separate, and where they might be. And so I kind of come to a story of just my own experience and a moment of realization I had. I live in Poway. And 2 years ago, I'm sure some of you remember, there was a swastika. There was a vandalization of a home about 2 blocks from mine. And it was around the holiday season. And this house had shiny, bright Hanukkah decorations up on it, just like mine. And I had a moment where I talked to my husband and we talked about whether or not we should take our decorations down, whether or not we were putting ourselves at risk by having them up, by putting ourselves in harm's way. whether or not we should make the gut-wrenching decision to hide away the things that would mark us as the target of this vitriol and hatred that was experienced by just our neighbors down the street. And the point of this story for me here isn't whether or not I made that choice, whether I kept them up or I took them down. The point is that because the signal to the world that I was different or that I was othered wasn't connected to my physical body, I was able to make that difficult choice. There was a choice for me to make. And for me, that difference has me reflecting on the privilege of the fact that I still outwardly can walk out of my house, should I choose, even if I shouldn't have to decide whether or not to hide that away. So that's how I think about the two.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's so powerful to be able to put yourself in the shoes of saying, well, wait a minute, I can take off my kippah and walk down the street. Well, I can't, but yeah, I can take off my kippah and walk down the street and no one would perceive that I'm Jewish. But as a Black man moving through the world, I can't wash off my skin, then step outside and expect the world to treat me in a different way. So my next question is going to be directly towards you, Micah. And the question is, and this is super important as we dig into this, what if I mess up? What if you say something wrong to someone, or you recognize yourself in a moment of committing a microaggression. What are some of the things that you've done to work through any of the missteps that you've gone through in your process of becoming an ally?
Yeah, I love this question, Nate, because it really is a process of becoming anti-racist, both as individuals and as a community. It's not a matter of if you're going to mess up. It's a matter of when you're going to mess up. Everybody messes up. This is really hard work, and that applies to all of us here on this panel. And you'll mess up too. Right? And that's okay. What's really important is how you respond to the situations when you do mess up, and when you lean in, you're gonna mess up. So nobody likes to do wrong, especially when it harms other people and the stakes are really high. And someone referred to earlier, that the instinct, I think, is to elicit or it generates these feelings of feeling threatened, perhaps, anger, defensiveness. What I've found for me is how important it is to resist all that. They are natural feelings to come up in that kind of a situation, but they're also sort of our enemies and obstacles and hamper us as we're trying to do anti-racist work. I think the first thing to do that I try to do, at least for myself, is to take a deep breath and get out of sort of a fight or flight mode and try to get more into a mode of humility and a sort of learner's mind where curiosity comes first above all else, and active listening in the space of not listening to respond, but listening to truly understand. I think it also is really helpful to thank the person who is calling you out or calling you in, because they are really shining a light on any given awareness gap that you might have, and then apologize and really own that piece and that misstep. And following that, really committing to do better and try to be specific when you can. I also think it's really important that if you get called out in a way that feels particularly prickly to you, really putting yourself in the shoes of remembering the impact that trauma and intergenerational trauma has on people. And while you may have misstepped and it's sort of the first time in your context, for somebody of color, it may have been the 100th time that they've incurred that same microaggression, and it comes out accordingly. Sometimes I think you need time to move through the steps in a really authentic way. And it's okay to thank the person for pointing it out, saying, I'd really love to think on that, chew on it, process it. Can we have a follow-up discussion? And then when you're in a better position to continue down the path. I often think about what Maya Angelou said, and that is, when you know better, you do better. And this person is really giving you a gift of helping you know better so that you can do better.
Can I add one thing to that, Nate? Or
Please do.
The rabbi and me can't
Please
resist
do.
the moment of articulating a kind of cheshbon nefesh that we do at the high holidays, right? That we this accounting of our souls and accounting of our behavior, and this is, I believe, cheshbon nefesh in real time. Right at the high holidays, we have this luxury of looking over the past year and really thinking about those moments where we missed the mark. But if we're engaged in this kind of work in a direct and meaningful way, and we are called, I loved how you said that, Mike, called out or called in to this conversation, we might actually ask ourselves, what brought me to that behavior? What brought me to that moment, that comment, that offhanded comment that we thought was nothing, but that actually was another cut, another aggression, and that actually hurt someone else. I mean, that's the essence. That's the thing here that's so important, I think, to understand, is that these behaviors, these comments, these things that we do that are mistakes or we mess up, and we're human, but they still have an impact. And we might want to really consider that first, not whether we meant it or whether get defensive, but what's the impact? And then what are the conditions in which I live, right, that make it so that I didn't think that would be a big deal? How do I change those conditions internally, externally, calling somebody else out when I hear it, when I think about it, when I think like it's no big deal? And how do I change those conditions such that the next time I find myself in a moment of flippancy or disregard or not really thinking out of what I'm trying to say, like, how am I going to do that differently? That's ultimately Maimonides, the highest rung of tshuva, right? Is when you get to that same place, that you're in that same moment and you do something different. And you say, I'm a human being. Being a human being is messy and it hurts sometimes. And do you really understand that you hurt this other person? And if you really understand that, then you're going to want to do better. It's not perfection. It is progress, because every one of us makes mistakes of all kinds. But this kind of mistake is so personal that it's an opportunity for us. I think you said it was a gift. I would say, but it's an opportunity for us to say, oh, you know what? I didn't even realize that I was taking this for granted in such a profound way, such that you felt outside of the experience.
Absolutely. Kelsey, I'm gonna jump to you in a second, but something that both of you have said that really is resonating with me is the concept of calling in, not necessarily just calling out. And what I think about with that is when you have a family member that's messing up, you love them, and so you tell them that they're messing up because you want them to do better. And in this situation, it's out of love, out of wanting to be in community, that I love you as a part of my community. And in order for us to be in community together, here is something that you need to work on. And it's not out of malice, it's really out of love. And I think that's really important, something that you guys both said. Kelsey.
Nate, I took that question a little differently. And it's actually something I've been asking myself for the past 2 weeks in particular, which is, what can I say? What can I do? What are the right words? What are the right actions that I should be taking right now on this quest of allyship and on this quest for to change the system of injustice? And I had to sit there with myself and reconcile with the fact that I don't have all those answers. But the one thing that I absolutely do know is that the opposite of injustice is not inaction. So nothing is going to change if I let myself be immobilized by fear that I won't be the perfect anti-racist, because I'm not going to be. And just as these systems of injustice were not created overnight by one single person, they're not going to be undone overnight by one single person. cliche as it might sound, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so if I mess up, I have to acknowledge it and learn from it and try again, just like Micah and Rabbi Rydberg said. But the only way that I can bring the change I want to see is by just keeping moving and keeping trying and recognizing that it's hard and knowing that if I make mistakes, I'm going to have the next opportunity. And not only will I have the next opportunity, I must have the next opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really grateful for this panel. I think there's been some good stuff that's coming out of here for folks that are watching. Recognizing our timing, I'm going to jump into a few more questions, and then we'll be opening it up for Q&A from the audience. So my next question, it's going to be coming back to you, Kelsey, and it's related to this concept of implicit bias. This is a topic that people have talked about in different arenas for quite a while. And what it actually means, or what it says, is that all of us have internal biases, no matter what your color of skin is, what your economic status is. We all have these internal compasses that aren't always accurate. And what looking at your own personal implicit biases means is looking at the ways that those beliefs come up in your life, and then challenging which ones are actually legitimate beliefs and which ones are things that have materialized through different different channels. So Kelsey, my question for you is, what are some of the ways that you've worked through challenging your own inherent beliefs?
So I'm going to even expand on that definition of implicit bias just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So implicit biases are biases that are ingrained in us in our life, but they are things we are unaware of. They are things that we are doing involuntarily, and they're unintentional when we act on them. And they actually might be in direct contrast to our outright values and beliefs. So because of that last part, because of the fact that they are in contrast to our outright beliefs, similar to what Micah pointed out, when somebody or some way an implicit bias is pointed out to me, it immediately raises my defenses. It challenges my whole sense of self. I'm an anti-bias educator. I'm a good person. I loudly denounce insert form of bigotry here. So how could I be acting on this implicit bias? How could that implicit bias be? And so, something that I've had to really challenge myself to work on is to do that listening piece without defense and recognize, because it was involuntary and unaware and outright against what I believe in, I need to take this opportunity right now to dive into it. So if you have the relationship with a person who pointed it out to you, yes, you can ask some questions, but this is also the moment for you to do some Googling, right? To pick up that book and not put it on somebody else, to ask, where did this come from? How did this show up in our lives? And use, like Micah so aptly put, that gift of that awareness being given to you to dive in. Something that was pointed out to me recently that I found really powerful was, if you have an implicit bias pointed out to you as something racist, the question isn't whether it was or whether it wasn't. The question is, what percentage of that was racist? What percentage of that was influenced by the system in which I lived and grew up in, and the media and the books and the comments that I've heard my whole life? And what part of it, like you said, Nate, is like part of my lived experience or true? And when you start looking at those percentages and using that opportunity to dive into, I'm gonna go with 75% of that was influenced by things that I've been watching, reading, hearing, listening, not even paying attention to throughout my whole life. That gives you 75% of things to now learn from. And I share that for me personally, taking the time to do that and not just sitting in the discomfort in the moment, but moving on to, okay, now what do I do to correct that in the future, is my biggest hurdle and something that I'm working on myself.
Thank you. Thank you for that transparency, and the fact that you highlight the fact that this isn't something that's a one and done. Someone doesn't call you on something that you've done that's a microaggression, and now that they've pointed that one time out, now you've checked that box, you've got it all covered. This is a lifelong process for all of us. So I really appreciate that. So my next question is guiding. Oh, I'm sorry, Rabbi.
I was just going to give another example of implicit bias that I think
Please.
men on the call can probably relate to if you've ever been in a synagogue. So synagogues pride themselves with their welcoming and their ability to treat a newcomer, right, with openness and inclusivity and embrace. Welcome, we're so happy that you've joined us, and please, here's a siddur, and please have a seat, and all of the things that our ushers and greeters in every synagogue of every denomination have been taught to do. A microaggression and an actual act of implicit bias is to see a person of color who walks into your synagogue and to assume that they don't belong there. To make the assumption that they must have wandered into the wrong place. Like as if they could have, if the synagogue is, by itself and there's no church around, or there's no mosque around. And I told this story when we met to plan for this, that I remember so acutely a situation in my previous congregation when I was a rabbi in New York City, where a student, a person of color who had joined our synagogue and had been in our synagogue for a number of years, was approached by another member of the synagogue, a white member of the synagogue, who said, "Oh, who are you? What are you doing here? And how did you get here?" And the assumptions and all of the implicit biases were that they weren't Jewish, they weren't there in the right place, they shouldn't have been there, and maybe they might have even been a threat. And they were equal, right? They were both members of the community. That's where implicit bias lives in my world, because of the presumption, again, to go back to the first question, right? That Jewish community reads Ashkenazi, white, and anyone who doesn't fit in that let's say, assumed stereotypic image is thought to be on the outside instead of on the inside. Instead of being as welcoming to a person of color at your door as you would to any white appearing person, that's an implicit bias, the presumption that they don't belong.
Thank you. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that brings me to the last question before we switch to some of the panelists or some of the audience questions. And it's that we know that we have Jews of color in this community. There are Jews of color throughout the world, but specifically talking about the Jewish community in San Diego. What steps can people take to further weave Jews of color, Black Jews, Black and brown Jews into the San Diego Jewish community? What are some of the steps that people can take? What are some of the things that you've used as a source for making that happen? Or has it happened yet? Kelsey, go ahead.
Nate, I'm going to come from the perspective of a Jewish nonprofit. And the fact that ADL is a secular Jewish nonprofit. We are steeped in Jewish values and have our mission, but we have a diverse group of people that work for our organization. Now, when you're thinking about who's working for your organization, what folks are being brought in, there's something about where you're even putting new jobs to come work for that Jewish nonprofit. We use specific websites all the time, and we think about them automatically. We also tend to circulate job postings or opportunities within our own networks. And so if our own networks are already not very diverse, maybe focused on only Ashkenazi Jews or other white folks, how are we possibly going to be getting and bringing in Jews of color or Black Jews into our organization, even to work, let alone in communities like Rabbi Rydberg's congregation? So I think that's a question we even ask ourselves as Jewish professionals. Where are we advertising this work? How are these job postings being placed? And how are we making sure that it's not limited to our own whitewashed inner circle, speaking for myself?
Thank you.
I'll just echo. I think when I think about the rabbis in San Diego and I think about the congregations in San Diego, I absolutely know that there are Jews of color in congregations across all denominations, and that's a good thing, and that's a good start, as it were. But I learned from Yavila McCoy, a wonderful activist, author, teacher, who in a workshop exactly on this topic within the Jewish community here in San Diego, actually, asked the question, so who's not in the room? In whatever place you find yourself, a synagogue, a museum, an organization, a social service agency, who's not in the room? Why aren't they in the room? What are the things, as Kelsey was saying, that maybe you can do, that you've defaulted to in your search processes for employees or whatever? And then how do you get them not only in the room, but how do you get them at the table, right? How do you get them to be around the table so that the color of the skin is really, it's not that it's inconsequential, it's very consequential, but it actually has nothing to do with what the person brings out, in addition to the fact that they are bringing all their wealth of talent and wisdom and everything that you've hired them for, or you've brought them into or you've represented your community in that way. And I've really tried to think about that. It's hard in a synagogue. We have 3 staff people, but I mean, in my synagogue, but there are synagogues that are much larger who deal with this to a much larger extent. Who's in the room? Who's not in the room? How do you get them in the room? And more than that, how do you get them at the table to feel like you are as close as you possibly can be?
Nate, I'd love to chime in also, just to kind of continue to build on what Kelsey and Yael have said. It's that importance of not just bringing them in the room and around the table, but also holding a space where different people and different voices are actually seen and heard. It can be very intimidating, right? Even if you're in the room and around the table, if there isn't a space to sort of disagree and to challenge the status quo, and there isn't a real value on alternative perspectives, it's really important to sort of back folks up when they challenge the status quo with a different kind of perspective, particularly based on their experience as a person of color. And I also think it's critically important that all of our organizations really excavate our own history of racism. We have to own that history. We have to truth tell about it. We have to apologize for it, and we have to try to find ways to make it right. I'm going to quote Mother Teresa here, in the spirit of world peace starts at home, that if you want to make the world a better place, go home and love your family. And I think it's critically important, no matter what kind of institution you're talking about, or community, the Jewish community, or the museum community, or the nonprofit community, you've got to start doing that work institutionally first, so that you can really walk the talk out in the world at large at that point.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's such an important thing to think about. What inclusion really looks like at an institutional level. It's nice to put it in the mission statement, but what does it actually look like on the ground? And I think what I'm hearing from you all speaks to that. So we have a little bit of time for some audience questions. So let me see the first one, and I believe this is open to everyone. Can you share the difference between inclusion and anti-racist? I think we as a Jewish community lean towards inclusion, but what I'm beginning to understand, there is a difference. Go ahead.
So as I've shared, I've been reading a lot of books and trying to do my own work. And I have to share just an analogy or a metaphor that I think is so important for us all to help visualize this concept of anti-racism. And it might sound a little trite, but bear with me. I read this in a book, not my idea, but it stuck, is the fact that doing racism work is like those moving conveyor belts at the airport. If everybody's on this moving sidewalk, and folks who are generally pretty racist, the folks that we think of out doing the explicit things we see in the news, they're walking along with and quickly this conveyor belt. And the rest of us tend to just stand on it. We don't try and do those things. We're not we're not generally trying to get to that same place that that person who has this explicit bias is trying to get to, but inevitably we end up in the same place. And anti-racist work, real anti-racist work, is walking backwards. It is actively pushing against this force that is pushing us all there no matter what, because of the system of our country and the policies and procedures and history that has been set into place. And that visualization for me has really stuck with me in terms of anti-racism, that just sitting and waiting and kind of doing the bare minimum, it's not going to cut it. And so when we talk about the difference between anti-racism and inclusion, well, just because I'm including people around a table, just because I'm doing something, I'm going to say this, doing something token, right? It's not the same as working hard and walking backwards and fighting actively and doing everything you can, versus saying, well, we have some folks like sitting in the room or sitting at the table. And I think for me, that's a really key distinction.
I would also add that anti-racist work or anti-racist comportment, behavior, right, is a process of unlearning. Inclusion is passive in a sense. You don't actually have to do anything. You just have to bring people into the room and be like, okay, look, we have people here. But anti-racism is unlearning the lessons that whiteness, in effect, for those of us who are white and white passing, to unlearn those lessons that whiteness has taught us about who we see and who we don't see, right? Whose life matters and whose life matters less, whose stories get told, whose ideas are listened to. And when we are in a position of, we're in a situation where we hear and we see those biases coming out, our job is to utilize our unlearning, right? Utilize our new learning, our awareness, our spidey sense, right? That says, this is not okay. And it doesn't have to be you're a bad person. It has to be, you may not be aware of how, let me tell you how this sounds to me. Is this what you're saying? Let me try to understand what you're saying. Anti-racist is different from I'm not a racist, because I'm not a racist means that I just have to believe you. But if you want to show anti-racist behavior, you have to actually show it, right? What's that line? You know, people show you who they are. You want to know somebody, like they'll show you who they are. I'm sure that's not exactly how it goes, but you know what I mean. And that's what anti-racism can be like. We show it, we model it. We don't just include people for the sake of inclusion.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'm blanking on exactly who says it, but it's the quote is something along the lines of, I can't believe what you say based on what you're actually doing, or, you know, how can I believe what you say when this is what you are doing? So intent is important, but the action is also important. Micah, go ahead.
I love the conversation on the individual level, and couldn't agree more. And I think also talking about sort of the structural component of anti-racist work, I often think of Audre Lorde's statement that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Or to quote Jimi Hendrix, that the world will change when the love of power is overcome by the power of love. There's a status quo that we all enjoy, and the inertia in overcoming that status quo is so extraordinary that it's taken hundreds of years, multiple killings, murders, up to the point where we are today, and what's been going on over the last few weeks. And if we look at some of the products that are emerging, I think the defund the police movement, as controversial as that is an effort to use different kinds of tools to create an anti-racist world and build different kinds of structures that head off homelessness and mental health issues, and address them sort of where they live in healthy and productive ways, as opposed to assigning them to the police, who are being asked to do so many different things that they can't do any one thing well. And in fact, we know the product of that, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I hope people take out of this conversation is the nuance of the challenge, and that there isn't just one solution or one way or one aspect that has created the situation that we're in, and that it requires a nuanced approach in how we solve the issue. And I love what you said about dismantling the slave master's house with his own tools. Like that's really poignant. So what I want to ask next is, many people on this call do not have an ongoing relationship with Black people, Jewish or not. How can these people practice anti-racist behavior when there is no one to reflect to them when they misspeak? Kelsey, go ahead.
So I think that there's more to this than just having something being pointed out to us in individual conversations. I think right now, especially in the 21st century, we have so many modes of operation in order to learn this stuff, right? People are speaking to us through social media, through books, through websites, etc. And there are Black activists who have put themselves out there and volunteered to be the folks that will do this teaching, right? We talk about the fact that racism was not created by Black people, it was created by white people. And so it is on us to dismantle it and to change it. And it doesn't necessarily have to fall on, or shouldn't fall on, Black friends or family to point out those issues to us. And so I think our first step, and this is something for me too, I recognize how not diverse my group of friends is. And so rather than just thinking about that as one means, we can put ourselves out there and start, again, I say this without being trivial, Googling. Looking into these lists that are put out there right now for amazing folks on Twitter, folks who have put on TED Talks, folks who have said, let us tell you we volunteer and we want to help you learn. If we start there, it'll move us in the right direction. And then hopefully one day, we are able to be around and have a more diverse group of friends, but we wouldn't have necessarily been putting that on them anyway.
I ask myself these questions all the time because I live in a very small bubble. And I have always lived in a small bubble. I spent my whole upbringing, in suburbia, going to a Jewish day school, and then I went to a university, and then I became a rabbi. And I've been in congregational life for 20 years. And so my opportunities, as it were, within my own circle, right, has been fairly small. But in the last, I would say, in 5 years, as I've been doing much more multi-faith work with my colleagues, my Christian and Muslim colleagues, clergy work, I have found myself making concerted efforts to not only make sure that I'm at the table, like as a Jewish professional and as a clergy person, so that the Jewish community is represented in these forums, but to also make sure that I'm reaching out and connecting with clergy of color, because just because there are 5 priests at a table, 5 ministers or pastors at a table, and there are a variety of colors and there are a variety of experiences, they're not all representative of the exact same perspective any more than 5 rabbis. Well, we all know that 5 rabbis means 7 perspectives, but at least. But that's that's where I'm living right now, and I say what I'm doing not as a pat on the back, but to say how hard. One of the things that I've been trying to do is within my circle, which is small, of people of color in my life, is to make direct connections. Not say like, if you need anything, I'm here, give me a call, but actually say, I'm thinking of you. I'm aware of what this time must feel like, even though I can't possibly. Can we, in a socially distant, appropriate way, can I take you to lunch? Can we have coffee? Can we collaborate? Can we think about ways for our communities to come together? It's about asking questions without assuming that the answer will be no. And that's the vulnerability part. That's the place at which we find ourselves to be like, hey, I'm the white girl and I want to connect with Black people. It doesn't have to feel that crass. Because ultimately, if you're connected to people, you're connected to them not because of the color of their skin, you're connected to them because of who they are. And that I think of as the ultimate goal, that we are just connected, that we have people in our lives of all different shapes and sizes and colors and religious backgrounds, and that's what matters. Trying to avoid a tokenism, a token economy here is key, but it will take some time. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to dismantle it overnight either.
Absolutely.
I'm with you, both of you, in terms of the importance of surrounding yourself with people who think very differently from you, to help challenge your assumptions, to create situations for those gifts or opportunities of learning. I'll also say, just personally, some of the most profound experiences that I have had in this kind of space are intensive anti-racist training workshops over the course of 2 or 3 days, where you really have an opportunity to sort of sit in your own discomfort and unpack it, and try to understand where it's coming from for you, and hearing from other people's experiences firsthand, which really shines a light when there's that direct contact that Yael was talking about the harm and the trauma that folks are experiencing, and pulls you back into the conversation instead of withdrawing in the ways that we've been talking about can be so detrimental.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to toss this question right back to you, Micah, this next question that came in. And the reason why I'm pitching it to you first is because of your land acknowledgement earlier. So the question is, some people say once we start talking about Native American land, slavery, etc., that these things aren't the fault of anyone alive today, and we need to move forward, not backward. I don't agree, but how do we address this commonly held belief?
That's a really good question, and I think it comes down to the discussion that we just had. When you sit with Native and Indigenous people, when you sit with the Kumeyaay community, and you hold space for a discussion of this nature, the pain that emerges out of that is palpable. And it's not just a 500 years old wound, it's a wound that is constantly salt is being rubbed in it. I'll take the museum as a really good example. Those of you who know our facade of the California building, etched into the facade are conquistadors and missionaries, the very people who raped and pillaged the local native peoples and took all their stuff and put it in a museum. And in sitting with the Kumeyaay and sort of going deep into these issues, one of the things that we have heard time and time again is that facade is so painful to them and is a site of trauma. And the idea of how we welcome those folks in when we're asking them to, that be our first step for them to walk in, is practically unfathomable to them. So I think the response is, it may have happened initially a long time ago, but that trauma lives on in repeated actions, and this implicit bias and all these kinds of things that we're talking about that continue to replicate that harm in macro ways, but also in micro ways.
Thank you. Kelsey, and then Rabbi, will jump to you.
I'm full of metaphors today, just where my head is at. So one of the things that I think that we can do when we have that conversation about those were my ancestors, that was history, I wasn't part of it, is recognizing the fact that people don't like feeling guilty, but that it's not about guilt, it's about responsibility. And the metaphor that is, for me, easy to understand is if you were to have inherited a business that had tons of money and tons of clients and tons of buildings, you get to benefit from all of that great capital that was built from the past, from your ancestors. It was passed down to you. And although you were not responsible for it, if that same business had a bunch of debt and negativity that you had to then go fix, You don't need to feel guilty for what that person who passed that business down to you is, but just the same way you would get to benefit from the capital that was given, you would have the responsibility to try and undo that damage and those debts. And I think, as simplistic as that may be, when you're having these conversations with folks who ask those types of questions, keeping it sometimes simple like that and putting it in a language that can be understood in another context, it doesn't have that same amount of guilt that they want to push away from, can help.
Sure.
So, after the Holocaust, there were reparations made to the Jewish communities in Europe as a way to acknowledge what was taken from the Jews of those communities, and how to somehow make amends. There is my colleague Rabbi Sharon Brous in LA teaches this text, this Talmudic text of the rabbinic dispute over what do you do when a palace is built on a foundation of a stolen beam. And one rabbi argues that the whole structure, has to be torn down, and the beam is retrieved and has to be given back to its rightful owner. And of course, no home can flourish on a foundation built illegally and immorally. And another rabbi comes along and says, well, what sense does it make to demolish it? Because, let the thief pay for the beam, the one who stole it, considering its full value as the foundation of what is now a beautiful home. Neither argues that you can pretend year after year, generation after generation, that the beam isn't stolen. So there's legislation that is currently now in Congress, right, about reparations for Black people, descendants of slaves. And this is not a small thing. This is not a toss away. This is real. This is 400 years of a history of our country built on a foundation of slavery, in effect, stolen beam. People who were literally stolen from Africa, brought here to be slaves. And even after the 13th Amendment, right, even after the abolition of slavery, mass incarceration, all of the ways in which people of color are still disenfranchised in our communities all across the country are other forms of slavery. So it continues. And so I would say that the case for reparations is a real one. And it's not just symbolic. And it isn't just going to sort of like put a Band-Aid on something. It's actually going to acknowledge that the United States of America and all of us who have grown up here and, look white and are included in those communities, we have benefited from that system. And that is worth dismantling, in my opinion.
Thank you. We have just about 10 minutes left. And I will be completely transparent that there are so many other good questions that I wish that we could get to. And like I said earlier, each one of these questions could be an hour in and of itself. So in wrapping up, just some quick last thoughts. Like if you, I'll give you all about a minute or two combined between all of y'all. So it's just a quick statement of what is the next step from here? Like where do you, let's even make it even smaller than that. What's a sentence you could say to someone right now that's watching this, as far as like how they should move forward in this moment? In a sentence.
I have. Who do you want to be? What kind of a person do you want to be in this moment and going forward?
Kelsey, you.
Listen to the people that are asking this of us. Just listen.
I'll answer in terms of what I'm going to do personally. I lean in very heavily on the professional front in terms of the work of the museum, but often less so on the personal front, where I live in La Playa, belong to the San Diego Yacht Club. My boys go to private schools, and my commitment is to lean in on the personal front as much as I do on the professional front to fight injustice and racism.
Thank you. Well, I'll just say I'm an avid sailor here in a little bit further north of you, but just putting that out there.
You're welcome at the Yacht Club anytime.
Thank you. So in wrapping up, there are just a few things that I want to say. The first one is, and this is echoing what everyone on the panel has said, what actions are you committing or recommitting to take as an anti-racist for sustained, start that over. What actions are you committing or recommitting to take as an anti-racist for sustained action and change? So this is for the audience to chew on after this call. The second one is, what actions can the Jewish community take to become anti-racist? So we've talked about that throughout here. And now, so this is something I want people to take back with them after this call to think about, like, what are some of the things that I can do within my own sphere of influence to really impact change? And so in closing, what I want to leave everyone with is that this isn't, like I said, my community versus your community. This is our community. And in addition to that, one of my favorite inspirational YouTube rabbis, Rabbi Abraham Twersky, says this of the lobster. And what it is that a lobster doesn't stay in one shell its entire life. What has to happen is that shell has to become uncomfortable. And it's only once the shell becomes uncomfortable that this lobster leaves the shell, goes, repairs, and then comes back with a new shell and moves forward as a bigger person. What I believe we are at right now, where the moment we are in right now, is a moment of great tension. And the tension that everyone's feeling is the discomfort of knowing that we have to grow and that we have to learn. And so what I challenge you to do is take this as that opportunity to cast off that shell, whichever way it manifests for you, and move forward into this next moment of a new shell and as a more whole community. So with that, I thank you all for taking the time to be open, for leaning in, to listening to what the panelists had to share. And I thank you to the panelists for being transparent and being vulnerable. And to everyone, let's keep doing the good work.
Thank you, everybody.